morning, everyone. I'm Seema.
And I'm Rob. And we just want to thank everyone for coming out a little bit earlier than usual. This year's feature are the 8:45 start times. We have a couple of, we've put out some graph paper branded with our presentation, so don't try to resell it or anything. There'll be one or two exercises as we go through the morning. And if you're going to tweet out about the session, this is MCN 2017-T2.
Handily on every slide.
Yeah, on every slide. And we are also trying to start MCN Change Agent, but we can take care of that. But
it's slow change.
It's slow change, yeah. There are actually a couple of change sort of focus sessions over the course of the day, so it's kind of a theme for the day.
So I actually did an Ignite, so maybe some of you heard that I was at the same museum for 17 years, and it's actually true. I started at the Cleveland Museum of Art as an intern, and I'm from Cleveland. I had moved back to Cleveland to work there. And thank you. And I ran a department that dealt with education, a variety of education forms, including the content for Gallery One, which was, quite a big project. And then I finished that, and I did a lot of other things. And I found myself really thinking that, and we had 6 directors, or heads of, it was exciting. And we had lots of really challenging things. And when Rob and I were talking, we found that there were so many similarities in how we dealt with it, because I didn't actually explode in any of those 17 years. I just survived the whole time. So.
And I may be on paper, one of the worst people to talk about change. So I've been at the same museum, the same department, and the same room for 23 years at the Met. But I've had 4 titles, worked on 7 teams, dozens of projects, hundreds of publications, about 4,000 labels a year. But some of these have been changes in roles that were sort of thrust upon me, and some of them are changes that I cooked up by myself and had to live with it. So that's something that that's kind of a theme of what we'll be talking about today. I'm a big believer in interconnectedness and mindfulness and empathy, and sort of mediating between different groups, which is also something we'll come back to. And we met at MCN 2014 in Dallas, and it seems like we've been sort of talking about change in a museum context ever since. So this sort of seemed like a natural thing for us to team up on.
And so we actually spent quite a long time. We started thinking about this session, and we had a sort of debate on how we wanted to do it. And I come from an education background, and I'm not going to make anybody do improv or sing. We sort of debated how to do this, and we had so much to say. And so what we decided to do was create a book. So there's going to be an ebook, and at the end of the session, we're going to give you the PDF to a free version. Don't sell it to everybody, please. And then eventually it'll be available on December 1st through Amazon. And if you leave after the session, if you give me your email, I'll email out to whoever would like to know that it's live when it's live. But the book was really because what happened for us, both of us, in all of these conversations is we had all these ideas, like about transformation and information and improvement, and we wanted to think about how do we make this most understandable for everybody. And so that book, it gives you some chapters that really deal with what change is, the effects of change, but then also some exercises, and we're going to give you a few of those exercises later in the session.
And I actually have a couple of heavily uncorrected proofs. If anyone feels like sort of paging through them while they're talking, I'm actually just going to put one out.
And you can get up and move around. We don't mind.
Yeah. We're not gonna hold you to it.
That's right. So the exercises, we're not going to do all of them, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name who asked me the good question. But for time, we think right now we can only do 1 survive and 1 thrive. And so if you look at my Twitter, which is Artlust, ARTLUST, then you can see that there's 2 polls running, so feel free to vote on the one that you want. You cannot quite tell what they are, so you'll just have to imagine. But the first is dealing with stress, so a stress list. The next is dealing with toxic colleagues. And then the third is using digital the right way. So that's one poll, the stress top category. And then the second category is thrive, and that is, and we'll explain more about this later, but we need this now so we can figure out what to do later. The thrive ones are turning change into a game, resilience, and mapping your journey. So you can go onto the poll and vote for one in each category. And to move on.
So we want to start by talking about some definitions of change, and there are a million definitions in all sorts of guides, but we want to focus on a couple of specific aspects of change that we think are important. We like the idea of change involving movement, really from one state to another, because it implies that sort of everything is sort of constantly shifting. Something we want to come back to is that change is a constant that you're going to be dealing with. Change always has an element of time in it. It's heavily temporal. It can sometimes seem slow or particularly fast, but while it's going on, you may not sort of have that immediate sense of time. But after it's over, if you've been through enough change, you sort of feel that it is a constant, not just physical movement, but temporal movement as well. We also believe that change is always related. One change starts a cascade of others, and sometimes it can feel like you're going uphill, sometimes it can feel like you're sliding downhill. So time, movement, and interconnectedness for us all add up to a sense of inevitability and a sense of it being a constant. Especially in the last year, it certainly feels like change happens by the second.
So, this is really an active session, but before we get there, we wanted to situate ourselves. And so this is a diagram that helped us really think about change. And we're going to go in from the outer edge, cultural change, to the inner edge in this presentation. I will note that when you do read our book, it goes the other way. And we did that purposefully because in the book you're going to be by yourself and really working through these things. Here, we're all together. So we're starting on the outside. We wanted to think about, we're not going to get really political here. We're talking about cultural change. We all have different probably philosophies. But what I would say is that no matter what your philosophy, things change. There's elections, there's, the daylight savings time changes. And so those are kinds of things that you have nothing, you can't control it. You're just one person. You might do all you want. You can go, you could do whatever you want to change. You can run for school board election. You can do all these things. But in some ways, those forces are beyond you. And the thing that's hard about change is this lack of control. And it makes you sometimes stressed. The other some of those kinds of things also are the social changes that occur, like a fad, like the fad of optimism, the cult of joy. Something might come into your organization, your director might have just seen something in a newspaper that changes what's happening on your everyday. That exists, and it is okay to be stressed by those things, but we also want to find ways that we can deal with those things.
And especially since this is MCN, we all deal with technology on a daily basis at work, but we're also sort of supposedly the technology experts. But that means we're really neck deep in how technology has impacted society and our lives outside of work. And all you need is for one of our social platforms to go down to feel like everything has completely been thrown into chaos. So technology isn't just something we deal with in our jobs, but it's also a larger societal pressure as well. There's sort of so much to discuss in terms of professional changes that we've kind of broken it into a few different areas, and I want to talk about institutional change in terms of leadership. And that's not just a change in the actual director or president of our institution, but it can be when a director or a president changes their vision, maybe from being, say, relentlessly collection-focused to being more visitor-focused. Something like that can lead to changes throughout the organization. They may be bringing in new people. These new people will have new vision. Perhaps everyone's being brought into to buy into this new vision, or perhaps it hasn't been made that clear. But it's one of those things that will sort of take the ground from under your feet, and the things that you believed were sort of a constant in your work. Another thing that leadership changes can set off are all of the re's: reorg, reboot, rethink, restructure. And after enough of those, the common thing you hear at work is, I don't know who does anything anymore. And maybe you're the person who is doing things that no one knows, or maybe you're the person who's asking that question. That all leads to a loss of trust inside of the organization, and that's a very difficult environment to be thrust into. Something we're going to get back to is the concept of psychological safety, and that's one of the things we're going to discuss as a way to deal with change, to survive and thrive in change environments. But in the end, what you end up hearing is that sort of cry against change, which is, this is the way we've always done things here. And that's something that people say when they're trying to prevent change from affecting them. And these are all sort of the pressures that lead us to question staying in the field. And if everyone's still here by the end of tomorrow, that's something that we'll be bringing up in the plenary session as well. So if you're still around, please come to discuss that.
If you're still in the field.
If you're still in the field.
Still in the field by tomorrow afternoon. Make sure you come by.
Exactly.
So the other thing a lot of us would probably guess is that we never have enough money. Our organizations never seem to have the money for the things that you would like, but somehow have magic funds that they could do something else. That can cause changes in your life. There's other kinds of things about being in organizations that maybe are academic organizations. They have cultures that have been there forever, and the change would require quite a lot of other changes to occur, so they're contingent on the other. The other thing about professional change that we wanted to talk about is something that we call museicorns. I've actually never said it out loud.
I think it's musicorn.
Musicorn, okay. We've been writing it so many times, I forgot. But this is sort of the people who are museum unicorns. And I mean, I would guess that many of us in this room have had this moment where you feel really good. And we sort of describe it like, I think of it as like that moment at the very top of a roller coaster. You feel so good, but you know you're going to go down. And sort of the thing that's challenging about this is that you've done a really good job, and you feel really good about it. And you think you deserve, like a little accolade. And what you get is more work. And so sometimes what happens is our organizations return our successes, not with bonuses or adulation or, flowers, but instead, more work. And so then what you do is you rise to that and do more work. So if you imagine back to the diagram that was triangle on top of triangle. So your change feels like you're getting more promotions, or you're getting maybe not more money, but more work, and you're feeling more and more stressed. And so that's another really important part of professional change that you need to sort of be aware of.
Yeah, and institutions are generally not well set up to deal with burnout. In our field, there's a lot of cries of poverty when we ask for more money or for more resources or for some help. Longer hours, less pay, long internships and long assistantships. And then you hear, again, another, well, we're not a business here, which is sort of kind of ridiculous, but it's the kind of thing that gives us change with more work to do, but sort of nothing around us seems to improve.
So finally, the change that we can really affect, the personal change. We have 4 categories of personal change, and I would think actually Rob just reminded me of when we first met, and we actually ended up being at a dinner together and sort of just fast friends. And that's something I would call sort of incidental change, where something happens, like you decide one day to drive a certain way instead of the other way or whatever, and it changes a lot of other things. So it starts this great waterfall of friendship, and this wonderful presentation and book. But you can imagine, we've all had those things. You didn't expect it. You didn't know what the ramifications would be afterwards. But it caused, actually what you see is later, if you look back in hindsight, quite a big change. That's a change that you can't expect for, right? And you can't hope for it. It just happens. It's serendipity. Another change that you often don't notice is the incremental change. An incremental change is actually the change that is most persistent in your life. And so it's like you can't see your hair growing. It grows, you're not watching it. You look up 3 weeks later and you have to have a haircut. That is the change that's happening right now in this room. Like something is, you're listening to me, even if you don't agree or you're maybe zoning out and checking your phone. Something is happening and it's going to continue to happen. Change is so constant. That is the one that I would say of all of the things that you're doing that you'll find that you are not conscious of. And the more conscious you are of where you are in what you're thinking about and like checking in with yourself and seeing where you change every morning. Like, hey, what did I think about yesterday? People who journal find that they're able to understand their incremental change more, I've read, because they have kind of checked in with themselves daily. And that is probably the one that, of all the changes we talk about, that's the one that you're going to experience the most and think the least about.
And change that, it can also be something that, that you start yourself. And often end up in the no good deed goes unpunished kind of category. But there are definitely what we call action-based change. Where you're the person who started it, and just because you started it doesn't mean that you know where it's going to go or where it's going to take you. And what we're hoping comes out of this is that you can still be this kind of change agent, starting your own change, but have a better sense of dealing with the ramifications of it and where it takes you. And then the final thing is the change that you can't control. Life just has a way of doing its thing. Whether it's family or illness, something just happens at work, layoffs. We've all known people whose businesses have closed down, colliding neutron stars, that kind of thing. So all of the things that we don't have any control over. So we have sort of the action-based and also the thing that we don't have any say on. The final thing before we get into the exercises is just sort of all of the things that we know are the effects of change. Some of them are positive and some of them are negative. Risk, uncertainty, fear, anxiety, confusion and loss are negative. Excitement and anticipation can be positive, but they're also quite stressful. And two of these effects, this effect that we, I think, feel most in our field is this burnout. And again, there are a lot of definitions. The one that we're choosing is it's a psychological inability to continue to do our jobs, and to do our jobs in any kind of intentional way. And we're going to keep coming back to this idea of psychological safety. I like this definition from the organizational culture firm Nobel, based in New York. A state in which individuals feel safe sharing their ideas with the rest of the team in sort of an honest and authentic way. So that's something that we're hoping that these exercises and our discussion kind of help people be able to visualize that kind of state.
All right, so now we're going to do stuff. We have some graph paper at the end of rows. People are welcome to pass them down. You can use your own paper. We're very open to all kinds of paper. We're going to do the use digital the right way. The other books, you can flip through our books and see the other two exercises. What I need you to do is draw sort of a X and Y axis on the on the paper, and I'll give you where you would like it to be. It's okay, Paul. Paul, you should put it where you'd like it.
Just enough to have two to do it twice.
No, I'm a museum educator. I want you to learn yourself.
We could tell you, but that would start a cascade of change, and we're trying to keep a controlled environment here.
It's even better when you know the heckler's name, huh? I'm teasing. I don't tutor geometry. I tutor art, and so that's why I say put it where you want. You can put it. You know what? You just need to have enough space. All joking aside, you just need to have enough space that you can graph it so that you can kind of think about each of the 4 quadrants. You need each of the 4 quadrants to have enough space. So it actually was a very useful question. So thank you. And I'm going to move over here. Can everyone see me? I don't think they're recording us, right? So, I would like you to put up here more useful. So, at the sort of, does everyone see I'm looking at eyes? Some people are looking at yes. Say yes or not. Yes. It's very early morning. I can tell you that. And then the opposite would be less useful. Your other axis will be enjoyable. So this is less enjoyable. This is more enjoyable. All right? So we believe in technology. We're at this conference. We also know that technology, as Rob sort of alluded to earlier, can be a real stress. Like checking social media. One of my co-presenters from my afternoon session, not to plug another one, but he was like, I'm so sorry, I sent you a text really late at night. I was like, I don't check texts late at night. But it's only because I had my dinger off, because I would have otherwise, right? So technology is everywhere, it's persistent, it's part of our job, it's part of our life. And so one of the things that we advocate is taking time to really think about, and I think underlying a lot of our book and underlying this presentation is that you can't make a good choice until you actually know what you're choosing. And so this exercise is about thinking for, let's say, a week about how you use technology. We're not going to spend a week here, unless you want to, I guess. But what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of time. I'd like you to just kind of look at maybe these last couple days. What technology tools have you used? Like Twitter, and try to catalog the ways you've used it in this graph. So if, let's say, tweeting conference notes could be more useful, less enjoyable. I actually find it very enjoyable. And I would estimate that I did it for 5 hours yesterday. So just take yesterday or 2 days and try to catalog. First of all, look at each tool, Instagram, and then try to parse out the parts of things. So Instagram, commenting on other people's posts. Instagram, stalking the famous person, whatever it is. So parse those out, and then take each of those sub-elements and graph them. Does that make sense? Before we go, I want to make sure I've explained it, and I go, yes, 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 yes. Okay, so we're going to give you a couple of minutes to do that. I'm checking my time.
And while you're working on that, I'm just going to mention one or two I'm going to mention sort of 3 key skills that we're sort of thinking about in terms of surviving change. So that'll just be sort of gentle stuff going on in the background. In our book, we talk about key skills under surviving in terms of self-care. It's a term you're hearing a lot more of, and it's about focusing on yourself. It's about not being controlling of your stresses, but just sort of understanding them, and by then gaining a bit of a sense of control, sort of as yourself, as these stresses are coming at you. Resilience, which is something that we're gonna that is mentioned more in the book and later, is the ability to bounce back from stresses, and that's something that we hope the book and these exercises will allow you to work on. And mindfulness, which is what we're defining as an awareness of one's thought process. Again, not controlling your thoughts, but about sort of being able to understand this process.
That's right. So let's give you about 2 minutes just to sort of think. So for those of you who are new, or who I'll reiterate, think of all the technology tools you used yesterday or for the last 2 days, depending on how you want to do it. Think of each tool, the different uses, catalog the amount of time, and then graph it. Marty? Paul, sorry.
Hardware and software?
Say it again?
Software and hardware too?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we leave it very open. It's what you perceive it to be. Yeah.
Other key skills that we talk about in the book are time management, and reclaiming and respecting your own time helps you others start to respect the time. that they're asking you to give at work or in other areas of your life. And analytical thought, which as opposed to mindfulness, where you're sort of watching your thought process, here this is actually sort of the ability to work with your own thought process and be sort of more intentional about your thoughts, sort of using them sort of positively and not sort of letting them control you. So again, so these are things that we sort of detail more in the book, but it's sort of as a background to this discussion of surviving.
Is it till 9:45 or 9:30?
9:45.
All right, so as you guys are doing this, you can keep working. What I want you to think about as you look at your graphs is if you have a good spread of quadrants, if things are in only one quadrant. And we define the quadrants as more useful, more enjoyable. This quadrant up here would be functional and fun. That is like all the good stuff, right? Like something like if you're really into Instagram and Instagram sells your, like if you sell at, Etsy store, you sell Instagram and it's so fun and you're selling stuff. So you get something out of it that is emotionally pleasing and it does something useful for you. Then there is the useless and fun. Your game, like the game that I don't know, Words with Friends. I don't actually play any games. I don't play any games, no. I don't have any phone games I can think of. But, something like that might be useless and fun. Where you, and I say useless and maybe you're getting release emotionally, but I'm talking about in terms of really like utility. So you don't have any utility there. Then there is useless and boring. This is the quadrant that I want you to look at. If you have things that are in this quadrant, useless and boring, that's like the bad quadrant. Try to find a way to take those things out of that bad quadrant. Because it has no utility and you're not enjoying it. So you're getting nothing emotionally out of it and it's useless. Not going to help you at all. Now, I say that. The thing that's really hard in the book, we try to be very consistent with, we know that you can't, the whole thing about change is that you can't control it. So there are things that you have to do, like when you ran a department and you'd have to go through budget ledgers and check budget ledgers, that's not the most fun. That I would actually call it useful, right, because you want that money. So the other thing you should do is be really thoughtful about how useless it is. You might want to go back and just check that you've allocated that one correctly. But if it's truly there, think about where you're going to get rid of it. And I can't tell you how to do that. And the thing about the exercise is, this is just a way that you know what you're doing. So you can decide. And you can make your choices. And then the last one is the one that I think a lot of us have a lot of. Probably. This was one of my full ones. Functional and boring at work. At home I had less. But there are things that you need to do that aren't like the most fun. This one is okay. So the reason that we did this way, to sort of summarize, is because there are things that, I'd say these three quadrants are okay, as long as they're in balance. And in some ways, if everything was functional and fun, really think a little bit about that. You have to have the night to have the day. Maybe you're really a very positive person, or maybe you want to rethink some of those things as well. Maybe you want to actually add a little bit of useless and fun in there. Like if everything you do is a use, if everything has utility, maybe you need a little balance there too. So I'm wondering if anybody had any questions about this exercise or any reflections or any questions just sort of my summary of it. Yeah, Trish.
I ended up writing a lot just right down the middle because I don't know if it's less enjoyable or it's just as neutral a choice because it's just like email.
That's a great question. So what I would say to you is, and this is the hard thing about exercises that would take really a day. Ideally, you would spend the day cataloging it, and so then you would know, because then you'd have that momentary thing. We have a couple of different exercises in the book that take a period of time, and then you do a reflection on it. So I will say that you might actually find, and for me, email, if I do it at a certain time of day, like if I do it first thing in the morning and then I turn it off, that feels so good. And so I'd actually put that in, like functional fun, I would put it pretty close to right here. Fun, that's why these are scale things. Even fun, I enjoy giving, speeches. This is fun. is this more fun or less fun than my wedding? It's still like, you can put it on a scale there. I had a great wedding. And I like you guys too. But, so what you want to do is, and this is a really important thing when you think about any time that you're trying to make sense of yourself, actually put yourself on this diet where you're like, I am going to do this, and I'm going to be really consistent about giving myself a rating, and not going to give myself a 0.
I mean, if you were giving yourself a full week to do this as we recommend, you'd be sort of keeping like a technology journal, and actually you might see email at night related to interesting newsletters that you get being different than email in the morning when you get to work. So that's something you can sort of suss out in and unpack in this diagram. And it might not be the first, you might not, you might have to start it over again to make it larger, to see different ways in that technology affects your life. And we're sort of hope during all of these exercises that you'll actually surprise yourself a little bit. If you've done journaling or done meditation, it's the things you're sort of not expecting that can actually be the most informative. So there are time elements here in a lot of the exercises.
And I wanted to say one thing before we go
Go
to
ahead.
your next slide. That made me think of. The other thing is, I would also, what I did when I did this exercise over the summer, I found that for me, time of day was really important, I mentioned. But I also realized that my mindset when I was using it was different sometimes. So if I'm using Twitter at a conference, it's really happy for me. I'm like, oh, and I can see this person. And then there's other times, particularly if I'm, going down some Twitter hole of click and then this, that it's not good. And so the more specific you can be, and I sort of said it, parse out your usage. The more specific you can be, the more you're going to be able to reflect on that change. And these exercises in all these different ways are about your incremental change, like the hair growing change. Because what you're trying to do is become knowledgeable about how your reactions to the world that is around you. And technology is a particularly good one. And I actually found that for me, and that sort of the next step on this would be to make a decision yourself on where. I told you, I would guess pretty hardcore that most of you would think useless, boring. Maybe you want to move those things. But the other 3, you make the decision on the balance that works for you. And so we say, you decide what happens next. Because I can't say that. I am somebody who, it doesn't, I could talk forever. Many of you, actually, thankfully, lots of friends came, so many of you know that. But I could talk for a very long time. And so for me to use Twitter all day is fine. I don't feel a loss. For some people, it is a loss. So you need to decide where your balance is. There's no right one. Any other questions before we move on? Or comments? Anybody else want to share anything that they reflected on? No? It's okay. No forced sharing.
So before we move to the other exercises, we want to talk about sort of our concept of surviving change versus thriving in change. So if surviving is gaining sort of the internal ability to make it through sort of the constant change that affects us. Thriving is when you take those survival skills and act with them externally. Seema had come up with what I thought was a really good analogy of a snowstorm. At first, you really need to make sure that you're able to survive it, sort of with sort of warm clothing and safe travel. But you develop skills over time that allow you to actually enjoy this kind of inclement weather, whether it's skating or skiing or snow camping, which some people do, and I still can't believe it. But it's the ability to sort of gain skills that move something sort of beyond inside your head and inside your body to something that you can act upon in the world, but also act upon with others. So what we're really focusing on with thriving is taking the things that you've learned and bringing those skills to other people, but also bringing sort of other relations with other people into sort of your sense of surviving. If you know anything about sort of Buddhism and the concept of the bodhisattva, which is sort of interest of mine, it's the kind of thing where you've sort of learned your own stillness, but you're going to delay taking that to its extreme because you want to actually bring that to others. And in a sense, when we talked about action-based change, this is really where you sort of make the change yourself and become active in it.
And so for the thriving exercises, they're a lot more imaginative. They're a lot more about the future in these three. And then some of you came in late, so we had a Twitter poll, and so the one that won was resilience. But before we move to the resilience one, I wanted to say, so all of the exercises, Change as a Game is where you kind of one thing I think that is very hard for me when I was in a very large organization was that I felt no control. And so here, this is sort of you have all the control of a board game. So we ask you to use those paradigms to create a game of yourself and whatever change you're about to go through, so that you at least are visualizing the next step. Because I think it's sort of like the fear of opening a door and you don't know what's behind it. And so this allows you to have some sense of control, but also some sense of, that you might actually be able to make change. The Map Your Journey uses something that comes out of user experience, like where you can do like a visitor map of a museum, or you could use us to do it. And but this is to do that again, but to take yourself out of yourself in some ways and try to pretend like you're doing a user map of your day. But we're going to work on the resilience one. And resilience, I think, is a word, one thing that we learned about when we were sort of doing all the research about change. Change is like one of those words that everyone knows. Resilience is another one of those. But then has a lot of jargon that's part of it. It sort of feels like a buzzword. So I'm going to ask you about resilience first to like anything that you see at like the checkout at a bookstore, like any of those like resilience pillows. Let's try to keep those out of your mind. Let's focus instead on sort of the concept of resilience. That resilience is like the idea that a rubber band can go back to itself. And so for a human, that means that whatever change happens to you, you can go back to yourself. Now, we talked about all those things. So, like, you won't be the exact same person, right? Like, I gave this talk. I will be slightly different. Somebody will ask me a question. It will make me think of this differently a little bit. So I won't be exactly myself. But the goal with resilience is that you start finding ways to, coping skills, to be able to be yourself or better self, but not a worse self. And so that's what you want to think about. You can be the rubber band that goes like this, and you want to go back. It doesn't have to go back to the same place on the table. It can go down over a little. But you're still that same person at your soul. So for this exercise, it's not as visually pleasing, so you don't need to draw a chart. But what we want you to do is take a couple of minutes to think of your most stressful moment and write it out to yourself. Write yourself like, a lot of the Thrive exercises are about like imagining that you're telling me a story about somebody else, so that you're kind of as rational as you can, taking yourself out of it. Just write it to yourself. Just take a couple seconds, or think it out if you don't want to write. I don't care.
Should I start on the skills? Or you want to go into the skills?
I'm going to do the next
Okay.
step first. Yeah. All right, just because of time, so you've written your story. Then you're going to go back and look at that without me, maybe. You could look at it and kind of circle some emotions, if there's emotion words. After that, you would, and for time, I think we're not going to go through all of it, write 3 different ways it could have been worse. And I mean, like, go crazy. Like, I don't know, this talk could have been worse if there was a fire here, right? Everyone's like, no, actually it would be better. No, but so you think of like absolutely 3 different ways that it could have been worse. And think about then the story you would have written, your reactions to it. Because actually your story, even if I asked you to look outside of yourself, was really about your reactions to a situation. And so much of what happens in change is the feeling you get is how you react to what's happened. And so whereas Survive is really a section about, and when you think about surviving, it is like, if there was a fire, it's me going, oh, there's a fire, right? Thrive would be me like, now I'm going to help and carry you all out together. Thrive is where you actually, the change actually fuels you to grow. Survive is where you just don't get flattened. And so that's why this kind of exercise, what you're doing is you're mentally imagining something worse and how you could rise to that as well. The final part of this would be then to take lessons out of this, so to pull out what your imaginary thrive is. So what you would be able to do, like, okay, so what my really good thing is I'm a communicator. I see that I keep thriving by saying something. And so then you know that your resilience comes from that state, from that activity.
I'm more of a mediator, so so my thriving is, I've sort of calmed myself, so I'm finding ways to sort of get other people to sort of feel in that state, or stop hating on each other so much. One thing I think we want to mention about resilience is that the effort does come at a bit of a cost. It takes work to sort of bounce back from things. So part of being ready for the next resilience is giving yourself sort of a rest time. A rubber band that you stretch too much will eventually snap. You sort of, I don't think the rubber band grows stronger, but you do need to give yourself time to be sort of ready for the next bouncing back. And most good articles about resilience will sort of mention that step. I just want to mention sort of the 3 key skills that we had identified as part of thriving. And one of those is reframing change as an opportunity. And the important thing about that is that that's something that you can't do on your own. That's something where you need to start looking at people around you, people that you know, people that you'd like to reach out to. And I think, like a lot of things, surviving is something you can do on your own. Thriving is not. Envisioning is something that the third Map Your Journey exercise was actually part of. Your institution probably has a vision statement, a strategic plan, a mission statement. You might have people who are doing UX work and mapping visitor journeys. There's no reason that you can't apply all of these to yourself. Come up with your own strategic plan, your own mission statement. What are your values? Write those down and sort of keep them around somewhere where you can sort of come back to them and draw strength from them. And finally, acting, just like taking action at MCN 2017.
Says the co-chair.
Says the co-chair. And we also like the idea of small wins and continuous improvement, which comes out of, if you've read about Kaizen, that's a Japanese movement. And it's often defined as small wins, but it technically means continuous improvement, or it sometimes gets turned into agile. Again, just because you read about it in the business world, these are things that you can apply to yourself. And we find that these are all helpful strategies for being more intentional about working within change and being active around change. And pretty soon you'll find yourself being sort of more entrepreneurial, or even intrapreneurial is another nice word, for somebody who's acting intentionally with change. So for our conclusion, or as I think Seema said it in the book, it's really a commencement. Because change is going to keep happening no matter how many of these exercises that you have done and continue to do. Any of these exercises you can continue to work on. We'd like you to come away with some points that this is work, and the vast majority of people are not putting in this kind of work to look at their own selves in a change environment and how they might act more intentionally in change. Only you can come up with your own most constructive path. And if you do something and it doesn't seem to be working, you can try it again. Because your path will change. Life will keep throwing different things at you. Politics tends to go on a pendulum. One person's resistance is another person's acceptance. and your institution will obviously continue to go through changes. Not everyone's like us who will spend 17 and 23 years in the same place. And
Yeah, and so, I'd also point out, one of the things we talk a lot about in the book, and we're not selling the book because obviously, and I'd like to point out, please feel free to take a picture of this slide, and so for coming to the talk, we're paying you to be our friend. You can get the book, it's up there, it's on Google Drive, just don't sell it to your friends again.
yeah, it's
but
still a little uncorrected.
it's,
so.
yeah, it is the draft, that's why we don't have it out quite yet, but, the thing that's really hard, and if you notice, we didn't really mention like a director. We didn't give you a clear path. So do this, and then this will happen. It's because we're just all people, right? And the only person that you can really change is yourself, for better or for worse. And sometimes you're changing that person without knowing, right? And our premise is that the idea is that you work as rationally or as sort of intentionally as possible. To be able to see where you're doing change and then make better choices. That said, you also have to, in order to be in that state, you have to accept things. And acceptance is something that we really both profess. Like, it's hard to accept the way certain things are. That doesn't mean that you're going to lie down. Doesn't mean that you're going to not try to do something else. But part of this is that for us, you kind of have to accept that change is going to happen. It's gonna. And our goal is, and I think to summarize, the only person who can make you change is not me, it's not Rob, it's you. And so our hope is that by hearing these exercises, or even just sitting in this room and listening to us, that you spend a little bit more time just on yourself, and think a little bit more about yourself, and that I bet that will make the way you interact with change a little bit better.
So I just wanted to throw one last thing out there. The book is pretty heavily footnoted. We have about 75 references in there. We also put together a bibliography that's on, I have a link there to it. It's on my personal blog. And we have sort of an additional reading list of books and articles and sources that are really important to us. Harvard Business Review pops up a lot, and I just want to put in a plug for that. I'm not affiliated in any way, but you wouldn't know it from the name, but the Harvard Business Review has just tons of articles about empathy and emotional intelligence and resilience. Only every now and then it gets into supply chain. You're like, but that just a tremendous amount of really useful information. So if you have a birthday coming up and you feel you want to, there's some relative who wants you to be more business-like, tell them to get you an HBR subscription. But that shows up a lot in our research. And that's it, and we want to thank you for turning out early this morning.
We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has them. Yes, but thank you for coming early.
Yes, thank you.
That's it?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Feel free to look at the books.
Yeah, we have a couple of uncorrected proofs out here, and if anyone wants to talk change, please come up front.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.